talk about a body of work that we've been doing around topping up wheat nutrition with foliar applied phosphorus. And the rationale for this project was that, as we all know, in the current systems, the most effective way to apply your phosphorus is all at sowing. But we also know the demand for phosphorus changes depending on rainfall, and having all of that phosphorus applied at sowing carries with it some financial risk. So can we modify the way we manage our phosphorus to try and manage that risk a bit? And the other thing that happened when we started doing this work was that a lot of soil tests were coming back as marginal to adequate for soil test P, which generally suggests that the management of phosphorus is entering a maintenance phase. And in that instance, most people use reduced upfront strategies or replacement-based phosphorus strategies. So our question was, can we reduce starter P and start to top up in season in a similar way to what you might do for nitrogen? The big difference with phosphorus is that it's only the phosphorus that lands on the leaf that's going to be effective, because phosphorus is quite an immobile element, not an elephant. So anything that lands on the soil surface isn't going to reach the soil root zone in a reasonable time frame. We did some initial scoping. We went through the literature, and we also did some glasshouse studies. And we did jag a response to foliar applied P in that glasshouse trial. We got a 25% yield response in one of the trials that we did. And the scoping also suggested to us that there was some responses around, but it was pretty variable. It was pretty hit and miss. The other thing that happened at the same time was that we had a lot of farmers ringing us, and they're saying, oh, I'm putting out foliar applied P. But when we drilled into whether or not it was working, they weren't really sure, and they didn't have checks in place to check out whether it was worth investing that money. So the question became, does it really work? And there are a number of factors that are going to affect the efficacy of a foliar applied product, whether it be a herbicide or a nutrient. And there are plant-related factors, so the wettability of the leaf, whether you can get that product onto the leaf and get it to stick on there, the morphology of the leaf, the properties of the leaf that affect whether or not that product's going to penetrate and then be useful for nutrition. I already mentioned that phosphorus is pretty immobile, so having good surface cover so you get the maximum leaf interception is going to be pretty important. And also actually having a demand there for that extra top-up of P, so the growth stage and nutritional demand for phosphorus. In going through the literature, there are a bunch of factors around the formulation that we thought would influence whether or not we could get foliar P to work. So the adjuvant that we had in the formulation, the pH of the formulation. The evidence we had so far would suggest that a lower pH was going to improve the penetration, which led us, in combination with the results we got from the glasshouse, to look to phos acid as our primary source of phosphorus. It was also the source of phosphorus that was probably the cheapest for the farmers as well, and the one that they were trying to use. But the form of P is also a potentially important area, so what other salts or what other nutrients are in that formulation. Then there are a whole bunch of environmental factors that are going to affect how well the spray works. We didn't really look too much into temperature, humidity and rainfall. We just tried to keep them relatively neutral in an experimental sense, try and create optimal conditions. But we did have a look at the influence of soil type and fertility. So we've used a really multidisciplinary approach. We've got a bunch of chemists working on this, some plant physiologists, some agronomists and also some consultants. And we've looked at it at the ultra structure type scale and right through to even demonstration type strips on farm. So the questions we've been asking are, what level of plant fertility, what adjuvant should we be using, when should we put it out? Using some work we got to at that point, we did some field-based evaluations. Then we revisited this idea of the combination of phosphorus source and adjuvant. And I'm just going to finish off with where I think we're going to head next. So in the startup phase, we had some CSIRO-based funding from the Flagship Collaboration Fund, and we got an international visitor from Spain, Victoria Fernandez. She's an eminent physiologist in understanding the structure of leaves and how they interact with formulations and adjuvants in particular. And she brought her PhD student Paula with her. And after lots of discussion and lots of reading, we decided that in the time she was with us in our labs, she was going to look at whether a wheat leaf changes in its properties with different levels of phosphorus nutrition, and does this affect the uptake of foliar-applied P. So some of the measurements that Victoria did was to look at the stomata, which are these openings that facilitate the exchange of gas and nutrients in plants. So the more the better, especially if they're functioning well. And she also looked at the trichomes, or the leaf hairs. And the leaf hairs are thought to largely control the wettability of the leaf. So intuitively, you would think the more leaf hairs there are, the less wettable the leaf is, and the product's just going to roll off and not be taken up. So here we have a soil from Black Point that's really deficient in phosphorus, and we loaded it up with different levels of nutrition, so 24, 8 and 0. And then we looked at how the plants behaved. So this is without any foliar P. And we see here that the stomata are really healthy, and there's a lot more of them at the higher level of nutrition. There's also more of these leaf hairs. The other measurement that Victoria specialises in is the contact angle, and that's using a microscopic technique where you apply a drop to a leaf and then you look at the interaction between the drop and the leaf. The higher the contact angle, the less that product is spreading. It's just sitting as a round ball. And so these leaves with more leaf hairs also had a higher contact angle. So you might expect that that would lead to less uptake. But we introduced Victoria to radioactive tracer techniques that we commonly use for looking at recovery of fertiliser. And in fact, what we found was it was having this healthy plant with more stomates that had the highest level of uptake, and that also translated into translocating that product throughout the rest of the plant, and therefore having a greater use to the nutrition of that plant. So around the same time, our PhD student Courtney Pearce started up, and she was really interested in some of the techniques that we learnt from Victoria. So she carried on with this contact angle technique and looked at a range of adjuvants in the formulation with phosphoric acid. So here we have the contact angle of phosphoric acid on its own with a wheat leaf, and you can see it's still attached to the needle that you use to sit it down in front of the microscope. And the reason for that is if we didn't do that, it would just roll off the leaf. So it's not going to stick to the leaf without any adjuvant in the formulation. And here we have Agril and Li-700, commercially available adjuvants. And in the bottom right corner is Genopol, which is a lab-grade surfactant, which had really, really rapid spreading. She checked out this contact angle over a range of concentrations because the label rates for these adjuvants tend to vary quite a bit. But similarly, they fell out in this similar fashion, with Li-700 having the highest contact angle of the ones that we tested there. So again, you'd think the leaves aren't wetting up as much with Li-700. It might matter in terms of getting some phosphorus into the leaf. We wanted to check that out because of the strange, potentially strange results from Victoria's work. So we used a tracer again, and this time we applied phosphoric acid at 2 different growth stages and looked at how much we recovered in our wheat plants. And there was no difference between those adjuvants. So despite the difference in that initial behaviour, in the end, the uptake was exactly the same. So the main finding out of this work was that it was the growth stage that changed the behaviour of the foliar P in terms of influencing phosphorus nutrition. So when we applied it at tillering compared to a bit later after booting, we found that we had a much better translocation to the grain, which tends to have a better influence on grain yield when we applied it later. So it looked like later was better, and we needed something to stick it to the leaf, but it didn't matter what we used. So using phos acid, you might notice that we had a much higher recovery than in the previous study with Victoria, where she used ammonium phosphate. And we also had a significant amount of movement of that phosphorus away from the point where we've put it on the leaf. So it's moving around the plant, which gives it a greater chance to influence nutrition and ultimately yield. So I think I've covered off on those key points and where we got to until we appointed our postdoctoral fellow, who was Evelina Ficelli. And the next step in preparing for our field trials was to think about when we might apply it. So we had a little bit of evidence to suggest that a bit later might be better. And here is a glasshouse study where we compared different timings of application. So the timing of application is up here, and then Evelina's harvested some plants 10 days after the day she applied it, and she also followed the other half of the trial through to maturity. So what she found was when she applied it at booting, she could pick up a response in biomass and in phosphorus uptake, but at the other growth stages we weren't picking up anything. But when we followed it through to maturity, we got nothing. So it was a transient response. It wasn't following through in terms of grain yield. So we've picked up this transience, which can happen in even soil applied P as well, depending on the conditions. But obviously it's a concern to us that we're not picking up consistent responses in influencing grain yield under controlled conditions, because generally speaking, that's your best chance. In this particular project, we only had 1 year of field trials funded, but in developing up the project, we were talking to a couple of consultants, and they sort of said to us, we're pretty keen on trying this out. We're probably going to have a try without you if you don't jump on board. So we decided to start a year early. It's a good way to manage risk. And we developed up some field trials that were on the Eyre Peninsula with Ed Hunt and George Pedler, and also over in the Wimmera with Bill Gardner. And so we tried to cover a range of soil types and environments in South Australia. So we had the higher rainfall and the lower rainfall at Lock, and a range of soil tests levels for phosphorus. And then we had 3 rates of foliar P and the 3 adjuvants to try and cover that range of activities. And we had 2 timings here, which might seem to counter the timings that we said a bit later is better, but we're trying to fit in with what might be practical on farm as well, and see if it's different under field conditions. But the reason that the grain yield is sitting over here and not in pretty graphs is because we didn't pick anything up. And the thing that really confused me was, on Cummins we had a deficient soil test, yet we were able to strip off 8 tonnes of grain and we didn't pick anything up. I would have thought that was really the best chance. So we've been through, most of it, the work is replicated, but then we also have some farm scale work, paddock scale work, where we're going to go back through some aerial images and yield maps just to check out and make sure that it fits tightly with our story so far. So at one of the EP sites, in case you think I don't know how to get a phosphorus response, the farmer wanted to put out 3 rates of sowing fertiliser, and admittedly these carry different rates of nitrogen, except that he went back over with about at least 200 kilos of urea over the whole trial. So he had 3 strips of sowing fertiliser, and then we overlaid those trials on top of that, and it looked like we were getting differences in our after sowing in our levels of plant nutrition. Admittedly they're not deficient, but when we followed up by looking at the tissue test after the application of the foliar P, nothing was showing up in terms of a response. And I mostly put this in for Andrew, who was in the last talk, because it's his farm, just to show I'm not hiding anything. We're really not able to pick up anything in these replicated plots. And as I mentioned on the Wimmera, we have some paddock scale stuff with replicated strips, and we're still going back through that data. And something that's perhaps perplexing us in the initial look at this data is that there are parts of the paddock that appear to be showing a response to sowing phosphorus, which is the x-axis, that are not showing much response to foliar phosphorus, which is the y-axis above this line here. But there are areas of the paddock showing response to foliar phosphorus and not showing a response to sowing P. So there's still a bit more information that we need to drill into to get our story and our plans straight. But as you can imagine, it's a pretty hard area to work in if you can't influence grain yield, especially for a PhD student who obviously wants to save the world. That's why you do a PhD. So we've really had to go back to the drawing board and start to think about formulation again, and whether the source of P was going to be a factor that we perhaps hadn't considered with enough attention. So we went back and looked through a range of pHs and sources of phosphorus, and also with a range of adjuvants, and this is in the glasshouse, ready to inform field trials for this year, and we were able to pick up some responses against the control here on the left for some other formulations that are not phosphoric acid. So here we have phosphoric acid, which we've done a lot of work with, not showing a response, but some of these other combinations of salts and adjuvants are. I wouldn't worry so much about sodium phosphate because it's a lab reagent, but particularly the potassium phosphates in combination with some of the adjuvants. It's Haysen Li700 and Spreadwet are what these represent, are showing up some responses against the control. So at least we have some direction in doing some more evaluation in the field in this growing season. So in terms of where to now, we're really looking at a careful evaluation of that broader field scale work. We're going to do some field testing of formulations. This is the last year of this particular project. We're still asking the question about whether we can get to the bottom of this transientium response, which is not a unique experience. It is tied up with water. A lot of us have experienced that, but there might be more to it than that, particularly for foliar P. And our PhD student, Courtney, is interested in whether scorch is a problem or a solution. So making those leaves a little bit leaky, does that facilitate better uptake or worse uptake? And the scorch that we're seeing with phos acid is comparable with some of the other salts. So the salt load can scorch as much as the pH effect. So that's the type of stuff that we're going to be following up over the next 12 months. So far we know that leaves that are really deficient in phosphorus will not take up foliar P, and I think that's pretty important because farmers often ring me and say, oh, I think I really stuffed up. My plants are really deficient in P now, I forgot to put it out at sowing or something broke or whatever, and can I fix it up? Can I just whack out some foliar? If those plants are truly deficient in P, the answer is probably not. We know that the fertiliser needs to stick to the leaf. You need an adjuvant, but now we're working towards which combination of adjuvant and salt are the best. It appears that applying it a bit later is better, but achieving really consistent responses remains a challenge, and we'll utilise the work we've done to date to try and go forward in an effective way in the field this year. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.